Hey everybody, Dave here. Today we're going to look at the loops group of actions in Power Automate Desktop. Like I've said in a couple other videos, I think the loops and flow control and the conditionals, those really should all be part of one group of actions called flow control. So let's go ahead and continue with our looking at various actions, just specifically in this case, looking at loops like for each, loop, and loop condition. We're going to start with a for each loop. And the way that I want to show you this is by interacting with the file system, because I think that it's a common use case that you'll need to do that. And what it does is when you retrieve a list of files from your computer, it's going to give you a list automatically. And that's one of the things that you can loop over when using a for each. But when I start this off, I want to point out that this for each will say value to iterate. That means you have to point to a variable and then you can iterate or loop over that thing and do something with each item that is inside of it. There are only three types of variables that work for this. There is a list, a data row, and a data table. I'm going to show you each of those, not quite in order. I guess we'll do list, then data table, then data row. But I'm going to start off with a list here. So I'm going to cancel this. I want to show you a folder that I have created. It doesn't really matter where you do this if you're reproducing these steps for yourself. But inside of a folder, I have an Excel file, a document, like a Word document, and then two Access databases. There's nothing really inside of any of these. I just named them whatever. And what I did though, is I created an Access database. I made sure it's above 100 kilobytes because later I'm going to delete files that are over 100 kilobytes. I duplicated that Access database and then I named the duplicate with the words never delete. And I'm going to use that in a few minutes here. I wanted to point that out in case you need it. And then I do have the source files right here so I can copy them, paste them back in here in case I delete any files. Now in that same location, we're going to get files in folder. And then I'm going to put that file path right there. Let me go grab that. Copy this. We'll paste it here. And then I'm not going to change anything else. It is going to produce a variable called files. Now let me save this. I'm going to run it real quick. And I want to show you that the type of this variable is called list. Now it does say list of files, and that's fair, but the important part is that first part. It's got to say list of something, or it needs to say data table here, or it would say data row. If it doesn't say any of those things, then you cannot use a for each on it. Next, let's grab a for each action. And then the value to iterate is going to be that files variable. And then there's a store into where it says current item already, and you can leave it like that. But I like to change it to make sense for whatever I'm doing. I'm going to change this to file because as I iterate over this for each is going to give me a variable that represents one item inside of that list. And each item inside of that list is a file. So I'm going to save this. Now, when I run this, it is going to loop over this however many files that I have, but let's do something with it. So let's delete file right here. And I'm just going to put the variable file and save. And then I'm going to run this. Let's actually I'm going to hit F10 on my keyboard. Okay, so it got our files. Here's our list of files. There's 4 of them, starting with index base 0, 1, 2, 3. Now, as I step over this, you're going to be able to see each one get deleted because it is looping over this list of files. It should have deleted one, deletes the next, and the next one, and the next one. So that's basically how to use a for each. It's not that complicated. There's a little more to it sometimes. I wanted to show you this use case because it's a little bit different than what you might use in some other cases. Like if you have a list of text items, well, you might have to do something different with those. But this is a special kind of list. It contains a specific file type that exists in Power Automate Desktop called a file. And each item you can see, you can click more, and then it has a bunch of different properties in it. So let me show you using those properties in case you are trying to use a for each specifically for files. So let's change this. I wanted to point out, what was it? You had like a few different properties. So we've got .full name. So you see how it has the full file path. I could actually put that here. File.full name. And then I could save that. I could do the same thing. Let me actually go get my files again. And we could do the same thing and run it, and it'll delete all of our files, looping through them using file.fullname. You, in this case, can just use file and it will automatically pull the full name. And that's why that works. So now though, let's say that we don't want to delete everything. Let's use an if statement. And we're going to use one of the properties of the file. So file dot size greater than, and the file size is in bytes. So we need to do 100,000 bytes equals 100 kilobytes. So if it's greater than 100 kilobytes, then I want to delete the files. So let me go grab these again. And we'll run it this time. Actually, I'm going to step through and you're going to see that this time, only if it is over 100 kilobytes will it even go inside this if statement, and it will delete the file. So it deleted one of the access databases, deleted the other access database. Okay, at this point, let's go a little bit further with it before we move on from this use case. Let me go get my other files. Okay, let's say that we don't want to delete certain files that are, have certain words in them. Here's where we can use another action in our loops group of actions. We can use the next loop. So let's copy this if, and we'll put it above, and I'm going to change this to use a different property. And actually at this point, let me show you that in addition to doing like dot, let's see, what do I want? I think I want a name or something. Yeah, dot name. We could do, yeah, let's do dot name. Okay, so you can do file dot name, but you can also treat it like it is like a data table or a data row or something. Put single quotes with square brackets around it like that to access the property. Normally this is just for columns, but it works in both ways like this. And then we want to go with, if it contains, never delete, ignore case, and we could just put it in lowercase here, it doesn't matter. Okay, so if it contains never delete, then we want to skip doing this next set of logic, so we can put in next loop right here, and it will jump from here all the way to the end and go to the next item in the list. So let's go F10. And what we should see is the first one doesn't contain never delete, so it goes down here, but it's also not greater than 100 kilobytes. Same thing for the second file. The third file does not contain the words never delete, so skip over that, but it is greater than 100 kilobytes, so it's going to delete the file. And now this fourth one though, well, I guess technically the third one now, contains never delete. Yes, so it's going to go to next loop and it's going to jump all the way to the end. And if we had more files, it would loop back up and we would work on that more, but now it's done with the list. Now let's look at how to loop over a data table using a for each loop in Power Automate Desktop. I want to go over to the loops section and I'm going to use this for each, the value to iterate over. So whatever it is you point to, and you're going to loop over and do something with each item inside of it, it has to be one of three data types. It has to be a list, a data table, or a data row. I'm going to click cancel for just a second, and we're going to go create a data table real quick. There are multiple ways to do this, but just for testing purposes, we'll go into the variables and then data table group and pull over create new data table. And then what we can do is click edit, and we'll just create some random data. Let's add some rows. Okay. And let's say that one of these has my name in it. And something else here. Let's save that and save. So it's going to produce a variable called data table. Let's actually change that. I just want it to be named something different. Table. Now we have a data table, and I could run this and I'll show you that it populates it with this data. And it's, looks really awful. Maybe we could have done a little better on the data that we put inside here, but let's just run with it. you can see right here that the data type is called data table. So that is one of those 3 types that works for a for each. So now we can go over and grab our for each action, and the value to iterate is our data table. So let's grab the table variable. Now, as we loop over this, it's going to store something, some data, each item inside of that data table is going to be put into here. And instead of calling it current item, I want to call it what it is. Now, if you didn't know what comes out of a data table, you can just test it and find out. But I've already tested it, so I know that it's going to be a row. So I'm going to go ahead and name this row. But let me run this real quick, and it's going to loop over the table. We can open up the row though and see that the data type is DataRow. And this is the 3rd data type that you can use a for each with, but we're not actually doing a for each on this just yet. I'm going to close this, and let's just use a set variable for now. And I want to call this value, and we're going to get a value out of the data table. But remember, when you are looping over a data table, so a table right here, you're going to get a row out of it. And for each row, you can do something. So I need to point to the row right here. Row dot, oh wait, not row dot. We want row with our square bracket and then single quote, column 2. And then we can set the value here. I'm going to pin this, and then I'm going to run this, and you'll see the value change as it loops through. And there you go. So that's how you can access data from inside of a data table. That's getting data from the data table. Let's say you wanted to update it. Let me grab an if statement, because we don't want to just change them all. And let's say if the value, if value is equal to, let's go with contains the letter S, ignore the case, then we want to change the casing of it. So take maybe lowercase and change to uppercase or whatever. So let's just take the value and convert it to uppercase. And we'll just put the value right back into value. And then once we do that, let's say we want to update the data table itself. So we'll set variable, but instead this time, instead of getting the value out of here, we want to set the value into there. And then we'll put value back into it. Okay, so if this is confusing, don't worry, that's okay. I'm confusing myself. So I'm gonna hit F10 on my keyboard, step over, we created our data table. So if I look in here, I think we're looking to do something with column 2 if it contains the letter S. It should convert it to uppercase, and then it should set the value back into the data table. Now, I think that this actually won't work. Yeah, so maybe this is a good time for you to learn this too. For each row in data table, assign to a variable called value, the value that's in the column 2 in the row. So it put ASDF, and then if the value contains an S, which it does, then go in here, change the text to uppercase. So it did that, and then set the value back into the row. Okay, it did that. So if we look in this row, it is updated, right? But the problem is, if I go into the data table, it's not updated. So it is interesting that it is like this, because I don't know of a way to set the row back into the data table. I actually, yeah, I'm not really sure what you do about that. There's probably a way, but I don't know what it is. To actually set the value directly back into the data table, you would have to do something like this. Table, and then whatever row you are on. So let's just let's run it back to here real quick. Okay, now it's going to set into index 2, which is actually the wrong row. I think that's going to be the second row. And in column 2, I can go into the table now and you can see that it updated it right here. So you can see I did the wrong row. But anyways, so it's a little bit weird using a for each on a data table in Power Automate Desktop. I don't know if I want to leave this. Maybe I'll leave this for the video. Hopefully I'm not confusing anyone. But what I wanted to show is that you can loop over this and you can do some things with it, but you need to sort of check the output, check what's happening to your variables, because it may not be what you expect. You might be thinking, oh, well, if I change the value in the row, then that should update the data table. But this row is effectively a totally separate variable from what is in this table right here. And there are different ways, multiple ways actually, to update the table. There are data table actions in the variables group up here, like this update data table item. The problem with that is that you have to use column and row numbers. And the best way to do this is with something like a for loop or a loop action. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. So, you know, for each exists in here, but I would say right now there's not a ton of things you can do with it unless all you're trying to do is read data out of it. Before we move on though, I'm going to change this what I've broken right here back to row. And let's make this a little bit less complicated, I guess. Let's not set it back into the row. And we're just going to say that we are updating the value we retrieved out of the row. And then, you know, we're going to change the case up to uppercase, and then we'll do something else with it. But for now, we're not actually going to do anything with it. So let me step back through this so we know what we're doing. Create a data table. For each row, we're going to extract the value from the second column, or from column 2. And then if it contains an S, then change the value to uppercase. But it's only going to change the value in this variable right here. It's not actually going to change it in the row or even in the data table right now anyways. And then it would do this for all of the rows. So every row that contains an S in that column, eventually we should come across this one, does not have an S. And so it skips and it goes to the end here. And then another way to do it while we're at it, so I'm going to drag this action out. I'm going to go get another action, the next loop. So let's put this here. You can check it like this. So let's say you want to put some complicated logic down here and you don't want to put it inside of an if statement, and more power to you. I think that's a good idea. So you have some things you want to do with it, but there are certain cases where you don't want to mess with that value and you want to leave it alone. In this case, what we'll do is if the value contains an S, then we are going to go to the next loop. So we'll skip everything that's below here. So let's do F10. I'm going to be pressing that. You'll see it's going to skip it and skips it and skips it. Now I guess I've reversed the logic, but that's okay. This is basically saying if it contains an S, then we're not going to do this stuff down here. So that's actually fine. And it should get eventually to the RPA guy. And it doesn't have an S, so it doesn't go to the next loop, which means it continues on its path and it gets to change text case, changes it to uppercase, again, not setting it back into the table, and then keeps looping. Let's actually add a little bit more columns to our table. Do this. I'll type some other random letters like this, and then let's say that for some reason we don't want to just loop over the rows in a data table. We also want to loop over all of the individual columns. Maybe we're doing something with all of the data. Maybe we're checking all of the data or something, but you can do that. So let's grab another for each and put it, let's say down here, and then the value to iterate. So remember we looped over the table in the first place, got a row. We're inside of that for each loop. The way to loop over a row is to point at the row. And what will we get out of that is a column. Now it doesn't matter what I name this, it's going to come out as a column regardless, or a data column. So technically I could just call this value. I kind of like that. We're going to take this and call it value. And now though, we don't need this anymore. So let's delete it. We need to, let's get rid of this because it's complicating things. So for each row in the table, for each value in the row, we are going to change the text case to uppercase. I'm going to hit F10 and talk about it as I go. So we're creating the data table. Here's what it looks like. 4 columns, 6 rows. Okay, we are looping over the table. We got the first row. So the first row looks like this. It's got all the columns, and then it has these 4 values. Once we loop into this and we say for each value in the row, which is a column, each column in the row, it's going to give us a value here. So let me go back and look at the row. You can see the first one is an A. Then if I keep going, loop in again, second value was ASDF. And then I loop again, JIL. So it's getting us that value that's in the columns. And so it's going to go for every single row. It's going to then look at every single column. So I don't know how often you really need to loop into a data table and then loop through all of the columns in a data row, but Power Automate Desktop does make it possible to do that. And really, it's going to be up to you to determine scenarios where you feel like that's useful. I personally don't think I've ever needed to do that, except for when I'm trying to clean up data, which there are other ways to do that, but I think that's valid. So if for example, you wanted to make sure all of the values in your data table are in uppercase, then maybe you could do this. But like I mentioned a couple minutes ago, is that it is hard to change the values in the data table, in the original data table, by doing this. This is really only useful for reading. So you would need to be like putting this data somewhere else. That's about it for each loops. I don't think they're that hard to use, but let me know in the comments if there's something I didn't answer or explain. But I think that it's something you can probably just figure out by testing. And I showed you a few different use cases or a few different uses of the looping over different kinds of things like lists, data tables, and data rows. Next, let's go ahead and keep using a data table, but instead of looping over it with a for each loop, we're going to use what I'm going to call a for loop, or this loop action in Power Automate. And what it's looking for is a number for you to start from, a number for you to go to, and then it wants to know how much to add to the number as it increments. So it's going to start at 1 and then go to 2, then 3, and eventually when it reaches, or what you'll see is actually it seems like when it exceeds this number, it's going to stop looping. What this should do is loop 10 times. So let's run this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I can't count that, but I believe that it looped 10 times. If for some reason it actually looped 11 times, well, you'd want to account for that in your development. But I think it just simply incremented it at the end, and it actually only looped 10 times. Let's, you know what, let's test it. Let's go set variable count, and then count plus 1. We probably want to set count to 0 to begin with. Whoops. And then now what we should discover is how many times it actually ran. Okay, so you can see that it only actually ran this set variable action 10 times rather than the 11 like the loop index shows. And that's just because I think when it gets to the end here, it's doing its step, like it's incrementing its loop index one more time, even though you're not actually going back up again. Now let's look at an example. Let me get a create data table action, and let's put that in here. Actually, I'm going to delete this stuff because we don't really need it now. Okay, let's add a column, and then we'll just put some random information in here. You know, this is information. This is data. Hopefully I don't type anything weird accidentally. And let's save that. So let's go get a loop action. And what we're going to start from is 0, because we're looping over a data table for our first example here. And what we want to loop to is based upon whatever's in that data table. So I can go over to the variables and grab data table dot rows count. And I believe since we're starting from 0, and let's say that there are 4 rows in here, we're starting at index 0, then that's 0, 1, 2, 3. So we want to end on 3. So we're going to go -1 because this is going to be rows count 4, -1 is 3. Okay. And then we want to increment by 1. The variable it produces in each one is going to be loop index. Let's call this row number. And then let's just make sure that row number will make sense. So how many rows do we have? We have 4 rows. Okay, so it's correct. So it should be row number should go to, it was 0 the first time, 1 the second time, 2 the third time, and 3 the fourth time. It is going to go to 4, but that doesn't actually count. It's not running it. It's just incrementing the value at the end. Since we are using a counter for this, we can do something like set variable. Now, we'll just have to use our imaginations, like this value is going to go somewhere. But we'll set the value and we're going to get, let's see, data table. And which the row that we're dealing with is going to be based upon our loop index, which we called row number. And then the column name, I guess we'll just go with like column. Actually, it doesn't matter. We'll go with an index. Nah, let's name it. Let's go column 1. Okay, and if I run this, you'll see that it's going to get the value each time it goes through. It got these values in order, and it should be, the last one should be this one that ends with HTRS. Yeah, right here. So you can use a for loop or a loop action to loop over a data table if you needed to. The reason this is especially helpful is that whereas with the for each loop, there was the problem of like, how do I update the data table? Well, with the for loop, you've got the row count that you're on. You know exactly where the data is in the data table, so you can just update it. So let me get this, and we'll do the same thing as before. We'll change the case of the value. We're going to take value and change it to uppercase, and we'll actually just store it back into value for a second, but then we will update the data table. So we're just going to flip these around. Put this here and take value out and put it here. So just flipped them backwards. So instead of getting the value out of here, sticking it into here, we're going the other way around. We're going to get the value out of value and put it back into the data table. So this time I'm going to use F10 so I can just stop at any point. Okay, so right now we have extracted the first row, column 1, and then we've changed it to uppercase right here. But if I look in the data table, we haven't updated it just yet. But right here is where it should change. So let's step 1 time, and it should have taken the value and stuck it right here, and now it's updated. So now I'll do it a few more times. We'll do it 2 more times. We'll open up the data table. You can see it's updated this right here. So this is what I find probably to be the best way to work with a data table using loops, is going to be this for loop, because it gives you a counter that you can deal with. Now, what if you want to deal with the columns? I don't know necessarily why you'd want to do this, but just to, to be, I guess, fair to the possibility, I'm going to copy this and paste. And now instead of dealing with the row number, we're going to deal with the column number. So we're going to loop over the rows as well. So we're going to start from 0, and we want to go data table.column count or something, but I don't actually remember what that's called. So it says data table.columns.count. So we're going to have to type that, data table.columns.count. Wait, can I just, oh, I'm dumb. I can just click that. Whoa, okay, that's confusing. Let's try that again. Data table.columns.count, but more than likely we want a -1 anytime we're starting with an index of 0. And then the variable we're going to produce is column number. And then let's go get these, paste it into here. We do have to change this a little bit. So instead of this being column 1, we want to loop through all of the columns. So let's put column number. And the same thing over here. We want to set it back into column number. Like this. Save it. And then now we should be good to go. I'm going to hit F10 a few times. Okay, this is the first row. So we should go into here and we can see that it updated, it updated row 1, column 1. When I go over this again, remember this inner loop is the looping over the columns of the first row. Go into the data table and we'll see that it's updated just the first 2. And now it's updated the first entire row of column 1, 2, and 3. Now, if I loop up here a few times, it's going to eventually, you see it drop down to this end stage, and it's going to go back up to here. And now what we're doing is the next row. So you can see row number is 1, which is actually the second row because we're 0-based index. And then it's going to, I didn't think about this. Is it going to reset the column number? It does. Okay, so it reset the column number for us. And this is one of the reasons that a for loop is so useful, is that it's kind of self-contained. It's giving you the variables that it needs. It's doing the incrementing. You don't have to deal with that yourself. Okay, so we'll just kind of run this through to the end. And you see it's looping, like 3 times for every row because there's 3 columns in every row. And now we open up the data table and it has changed every single value to a capital. So you could do this to clean up data, was something I was going to say. And I think that that's fair. I think there might be other ways to do it, but this is like pretty easy. And I think that even a novice could handle this. It might be a little confusing at first, but with a little bit of practice dealing with this loop and dealing with the concept of starting from this number and going to this number, and then passing that variable, those variables for row number and column number, into something like this, then that'll work out. What I would encourage you to do, and I think that will help you a lot to learn this, because you might even be looking at what I've just done and go like, Dave, that didn't help me at all. And like, fair, I'm not blaming you for that. Name your variables in a way that will make sense to you. So maybe maybe row number doesn't make sense to you. Maybe you want to call it something else, or a column number. Maybe you like the word field, whatever. Call it something that makes sense to you, because the easier that the variables are named, the quicker it is going to be to internalize it in your mind for how this is working, and then you'll be able to reproduce it later. Now, this next action, we are going to test this out using a concept, or I guess a use case or whatever, an example that I'm definitely stealing from Anders Jensen. So I appreciate it. I looked up one of your videos and I was like, trying to think what's a good example of how to use a while loop. Why would you use that? And I can think of tons of examples, but usually it's like a real example and I would need to do a bunch of extra stuff. And he showed just using a user input form. And I was like, goodness gracious, I didn't even think about that. So anyway, I stole that idea. Let's go ahead and start by grabbing a loop condition. And this is a while loop. And what we're going to do is we're going to go with user input equal to, oh wait, no, just is empty. No. Okay. You can't, that's interesting. You can't do is empty. I think we want to loop while the user input is empty. So I'm going to put an empty string. So percent and then 2 single quotes and then percent. Save that. And then it's saying that the user input doesn't exist. So I don't know that I necessarily have to do this, but I'm going to do it just in case. We're going to call this user input, and we will set the value to empty to begin with. And then we can see if I run this, it's going to loop forever because user input is always going to be empty. And so I want to do something that will change that at some point. If I haven't said this already, a loop condition is for the purpose of looping forever. That's why you can call it a while loop. Actually, it says while right here. Why is it not just called a while loop? Anyways, while something is true, you continue to do something inside of here. Okay, so let me go grab a custom form. I love these custom forms. best update in Power Automate. So we need a text input. The label is going to be provide a value to stop. And I think we need 2 buttons, actually. We need a submit button. And I guess they're both submit buttons, technically. So I think we want the cancel button on the right. So the submit to is going to become cancel. And I'm actually going to change its title to cancel as well. Submit. I want this to be okay. And okay. That way I don't have to deal with the confusion between the ID and the title. And whenever we click this, I assume one of these values comes out of it. I can't remember which one, but it's either going to be this or this. Oh, and then this value, variables produced, a custom object containing the user's input, and button pressed. Okay. Now let's see, custom. We might have to run this once to get a value. So let's put a breakpoint, run it, and then let's click OK. Custom form data is a custom object and it has a property called text input. Can I change that? I can. Okay, so let's just go input like this, save it, and then I think that what we can do is set variable. Yeah, we can set the variable user input and we get custom form data dot input. Syntax error. Cause I guess it's not a property. It's like a field, column. Seems like it should be a property though, but okay. Let's run this, and what it should do is pop up right here. I'm gonna just click OK, and then what it should do is take what I gave it and set that value into user input. So then when I loop again by pressing F10, it's gonna evaluate this again. User input is equal to empty. Yes, it is. Well, it's gonna go again, ask me the question. This time I'm gonna say test, okay, and it should take that value, put it into custom form data input. And then now I'm going to take the value out of custom form data input and put it into user input. So now it's here. And then when I loop up again, it's going to say while user input is empty. And since now it's no longer empty, it's going to leave the loop. So I'm going to unbreak it. And then we'll just test this a little bit. Click OK, click OK. And we can just keep doing this forever. And that's really the point, is if you don't know how many times you need to loop, then a while loop is your best friend. An example of a time where I will use this is if there is some, I'll go ahead and click cancel now. Oh, you know what? That's another thing, is what if you don't want to provide a value? Okay, I'll go ahead and finish my thought. One way that I'll use this a lot of times is I will have something like, a flow that I just trigger, and it just sits there waiting for me to trigger. It waits for me to press certain keys. When I press that, it runs some flow, but then once it's done running that, it goes back to a waiting state. And the best way, well, a way to do that is with a while loop so that it just keeps going to the top. So let me go ahead and click cancel, and let's see here. What I want to do is change this so that if cancel is pressed, then we stop the flow. So if button pressed is equal to cancel, then we want to stop flow like this. So now I could click OK and it'll keep going, because if button pressed is not equal to cancel, it'll keep going. But as soon as I click cancel, it's going to stop. And that's one way to get out of a while loop. Let me delete stop flow. The last action we haven't gone over is exit loop right here. So I'm going to drop that in the same place that I had the stop flow, and we'll run that now. And in this case, it's going to have the same effect as stop flow. It's just that I don't have any more logic down below here. So let me maybe put something like this at the end. Put a breakpoint just to show you that stop flow and it do not work the same. Okay, let's put cancel, and it went exit loop, so it jumped down to end, didn't go back up and loop anymore, and it goes down, and now we're still running. We have other things that we need to do. So that is a while loop, and I think this is going to be one of those things where you just need to get experience with building flows, and as you come across more situations that you need to automate, more use cases and stuff, you will find times when you need to use a while loop or whatever. And you just need to try to force yourself to use it, and you'll start to kind of know immediately which one you want to use when you come across that scenario. So let me show you one more thing about a while loop or a loop condition. You can set it like this: first operand true, and the second operand true. This will always be true. So what we've built is an infinite loop. So we can run like this forever. And that's where, you know, there might be some situation where you want to detect it and use an exit loop in order to exit it. So in this case, if I ran it, it would immediately exit because it got to this and then it left the loop instantly. The last thing that I want to show you is that you can do some kind of advanced things. I don't know that I'd really call this advanced necessarily, but there might be times where you come across a data type called list of lists. I'm going to go add item to list, and this is just going to automatically create a list for us. You know what I need? I need a for loop. So let's go get a loop right here. I want to loop from 1 to 10, increment by 1, save, and then I need to add item. Yeah, add item to a list. So what we're going to do is create for ourselves a list. I'm going to add the loop index. So let's say the number, and then it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Into list, I think we just have to create one because one doesn't exist. Some list. Okay, so what I can do is run this, and you'll see it should add 10 items to my list. And this is something that you could use a for each loop on because it says list of text values. But something you might come across sometimes is a list of lists. And so that's what I want to create right now. So let's take, once we've done this, I think I'm just going to cheat a little bit and go, I'm not going to use a loop for this. I'll just go add some list. I'll call this variable list of lists. And then we'll just cheat and add it a couple times like this. So it's going to add the same list to this list, but that's okay. So we're going to create a list up here. We'll run that. And it's going to add the number 1, the number 2, all the way up to 10 like this into a list. So it's a list of text values. But now I'm going to put that list that I just created into another list. Okay, so now we have list of lists, and you can actually see that the data type is list of lists of text values. It's not that hard once you kind of play around with it. Let me add a couple more to it. I'll just run, and I just duplicated this, right? So it added the same list multiple times. But in our list of lists, we have 3 lists inside of it. And when you want to loop over that, you can do a for each on the, let's see, the list of lists. And what that's going to do is give you a list each time. And then inside of this, you want to loop over the list. Whoops. And maybe we'll just call this item. I guess we could call it text. Like this. And then we'll do set variable just so we can do something with it. Oh, wait, we don't actually have to do that. We can leave this out because when it loops over it, it's going to put the value into text. So let's run to here. creates our list, adds it 3 times to another list. And now what we're going to do is go for each list in the list of lists. So it gives us a list right here. And then we can loop inside of that list. It gives us text number 1. And then we can keep looping inside of that list. Eventually, we'll get to the end of it. Now we're going to go to the second item, which is another list. Second item right here. And we can loop over that one. And then we'll go to the third item that's in list of lists, which is another list. And we can loop through that one. So there's a bunch of funky things that you can do with this. I think I've probably said this a few times in this video. You'll just have to decide for yourself, like, when do you need to use each of these types of loops. I hope that I've given you several of examples that are working. I don't know if it necessarily is exactly what you need. If I didn't address something that you're looking for, leave me a comment and I'll reply to you the best I can. All right. Well, that has been quite a lengthy video talking about loops. Well, anyways, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.